In this lecture, we will review how to respond to and reduce prejudice. History is littered with examples of the physical, psychological, and economical harm that prejudice can cause to people, such as in genocide, enslavement, and colonization. And these often continue to affect the targeted groups many generations after their occurrence. But prejudice can also lead to less visible discrimination in hiring, career advancement, healthcare, legal proceedings, and loan opportunities. Of greatest relevance to the study of social psychology are the psychological effects of frequently feeling devalued within one's culture. When experienced chronologically, feeling socially devalued can have detrimental effects on health and well-being. In all these ways, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination contributes to poverty and physical, behavioral, and mental health problems. We will focus on what happens psychologically to people who are targeted by prejudice and the ways in which they cope. Also, the processes that influence how and whether people perceive the prejudice they experience and how they respond to it. How even subtle encounters with prejudice and stereotypes can affect one's health, behavior, and performance. And how members of stigmatized groups can remain resilient despite social biases and discrimination. Lastly, we will also review some promising strategies that can be used to reduce prejudice. So let us first review prejudice from a target's perspective. Regardless of how accurately prejudice is perceived, being a target of bias can have negative consequences for psychological and physical health. Now, let us review perceiving prejudice. Because modern prejudice is less overt, it is difficult to know if and when one is the target of prejudice. People differ in their sensitivity to prejudice, but people commonly underestimate personal discrimination. People may be motivated to deny discrimination out of optimism or a desire to justify the social system. Prejudice can take a toll on a person's mental and physical health. Now let us go over the harmful impact of stereotypes. Holding a stereotype can change how observers interact with targets, sometimes causing targets to act stereotypically. Targets sometimes inadvertently act stereotypically to get along with others. Self-objectification, viewing the self as an object to be looked at, can undermine health and performance. Now, a stereotype threat is the fear of confirming a negative stereotype can undermine one's performance. And the social identity threat is the feeling that your group does not belong in a domain and repel people from that domain. So the question is, what's a target to do? How do one cope with stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination? Given some of the evidence we've received and the consciousness associated with prejudice and stereotyping, we might expect targets of bias to feel rather lousy about themselves. Interestingly, one review of the literature reveals surprisingly little evidence that people stigmatized based on race, ethnicity, physical disability, or mental illness report lower levels of self-esteem than those who are not normally stigmatized. This seems to run counter to common sense and to many of the theories we've covered thus far, but, however, suggests that people's self-esteem is influenced by how others treat them. So, how do people who are devalued by society in general minimize those hits to self-esteem and remain resilient in the face of stigmatization? Well, research has revealed some strategies for mitigating stereotype concerns, as well as coping skills that targets use to protect their self-esteem and overall sense of well-being against the daily jabs of prejudice. Let's look at a few, starting with strategies that are particularly applicable to being stereotyped, and then move into the broader experience of being the target of prejudice. Of course, as is so often the case, sometimes the solutions open the door to other problems as well. So, how do we cope with stereotypes and social identity threat? Well, we've reviewed the powerful role that prejudice and negative stereotypes can play in shaping behavior, self-perception, performance, and career preferences. But fortunately, research has also pointed to several ways in which these processes can be eliminated. These findings have important implications for educational and social policies. Ways to overcome stereotype threat include identification with role models, reappraisal of anxiety as normal, and self-affirmation. To address or minimize their experience of prejudice in social interactions, stigmatized targets use confrontation, compensation, concealment, and coming together. To minimize the negative psychological effects of social devaluation, stigmatized targets can discount negative outcomes or devalue domains where they experience discrimination. These strategies can benefit targets in some situations, but they can also backfire or create new problems. So, in an attempt to reduce prejudice, we must first understand prejudice does not have a single cause. Various strategies are available to reduce it, such as changing the culture. Long-term systematic reduction of prejudice requires changing laws, customs, and norms. Next, controlling prejudice in interactions. Individuals can prevent their automatically activated prejudices from affecting their behavior. However, controlling prejudice is not always easy and can backfire. Now, moving on to the contact hypothesis. According to Alport's conditions, optimal intergroup contact can reduce prejudice when it involves 1. Equal status, 2. Potential to make friends, 3. Cooperation towards shared goals, and 4. Buy-in from those in power. Optimal contact reduces stereotyping, decreases intergroup anxiety, increases empathy for the outgroup. Now, positive effects of contact are often weaker for members of the minority group, and the jigsaw classroom is an application of optimal contact to education. Lastly, Reducing prejudice without contact. Perspective taken increases empathy and decreases negative stereotypes. Bolstering people's good feelings about themselves helps them feel less threatened by those who hold different views. And multiculturalism is perhaps the most effective ideology for reducing biases held by the majority, while also valuing diverse perspectives held by minority groups. Social psychology has taught us a lot, not just about where prejudice comes from and how it is activated, but also how it can be reduced. Yes, there is a long and varied list of cures, but that's because biases has many different causes and manifestations. Although our interests can motivate us to control our biases, the bottom line is that seeking out common ground and understanding, while also embracing the value of different viewpoints and perspectives, may be the most effective way of achieving intergroup harmony.